Hello, friends, and welcome to I Know I Belong When, an innovation, unbiased production where bold voices, curious stories, and authentic impact amplify knowing you are invited, seen, heard, and needed. I am your host, Christopher Bylone, Principal Strategist at Innovation Unbiased. This is more than a conversation. It is a movement, a mirror, a megaphone, one where raw truth meets radical hope. Welcome back to the show. Today's guest is the navigator of influence leaders call when stakes are high and the story needs to shift. Mike Lynch is the founder and principal of MJL Consulting Group, helping leaders get unstuck, level up, and go all in, not someday, today. Mike brings 30 years of experience across corporate and nonprofit arenas, including a powerhouse run at Capital One, from VP of HR Business Partnering to the head of international HR in the UK, and even the UK's Chief Diversity Officer. Translation, he knows how to ignite growth, orchestrate transformation, and catalyze success at every altitude of an organization. He is widely described as the client whisperer, the coach that helps leaders see differently, shift perspective, and navigate the inevitability of change without losing their sanity. He is the creator of the Ally to All In approach and the author of the book From Ally to All In, published in September 2025, which primarily guides white men from passive allyship to active, wholehearted leadership in inclusive cultures. And because belonging is about becoming, here's a personal twist. At 50, Mike challenged himself to learn a new skill every year, from wild swimming and boxing to Spanish, writing and rowing, and sewing. Let's just say the bobbin fought back. He is still taking suggestions though, so bring them on. Friends, it's time to get unstuck, level up, and go all in. Mike, welcome to I Know I Belong When.
Hey, thank you, Christopher. I'm happy to be here. And I want to meet that person you just introduced. So I appreciate the introduction. So it was fun to listen to.
You make it fun for me. So you just met yourself again. So
yeah, there you go.
Welcome. Alrighty. So let's dive into this conversation. So you talk about going from ally to all in. What changed for you to be talking about allyship to being all in? And what are the norms that you expect leaders to have that look like you to be able to move to that all-in approach?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of things. So the shift really happened for me when I realized that believing in inclusion wasn't the same as advancing it. You know, for years I thought being a good guy was enough and being supportive, well-intended, fair-minded. But a couple of different moments kind of pushed me towards this work in there. So one was, becoming a father to two daughters, as well as like leading in rooms where decisions, shaped careers in my role within HR. In the sense of, for me, being a father to two daughters, so I really started to see that those unearned advantages I had, and I really saw them not necessarily as guilt, but as a responsibility to, kind of how I sort of shape that. And really the inflection point was really around the understanding that allyship itself can be really passive, but leadership is really active. And, so an ally to me really meant around using my own voice in those rooms where others aren't present, pushing on my peers when it's uncomfortable, and really staying at the table when conversations gets messy. So to answer the second part of your question, it's really around pushing my peers in the space of when it's uncomfortable and messy, just stick around and stay there and sort of lean into those conversations right there.
That's really powerful. I love what you said about allyship can be passive, but leadership is about action. That's really impactful. And hopefully listeners, you're kind of understanding about how you need to lean in and lean forward and not just sit on the sidelines. Like, you need to be active in this process.
Absolutely.
Okay. So your book rejects the ideology of finger pointing. And so what's the first kind of two behavioral commitments you ask leaders, especially white men, to make on day one as they move into this all-in approach?
Sure. So, as I work with leaders, I initially ask them to focus on two commitments. So the first commitment is really around awareness. And what I say that it's not performative awareness, but it's really honest internal awareness about their own identity, their own experience with their gender or identity or race, and really understanding and becoming aware of the privilege that they have, and really understanding and being aware of the impact of the behavior or our behavior as white men. So that's the first one, is really awareness. The second one is really around accountability. So being accountable for our own learning, our own blind spots, our mistakes that we're making in this space, being accountable for our influence and our contribution to this conversation. And really, to me, it's not about shame. It's just all about ownership in this space. So those two behaviors, I would say awareness and accountability, it's really around see and notice what's real, own what's yours. And then those two things, I believe, start to unlock hopefully everything else on your path to going all in.
That's really great. Thank you for that. So I want to keep going on that line of accountability. And as we start to talk about the importance of getting people's names right, because for me, that is the first act of belonging, is getting somebody's name right. But accountability about when somebody gets it wrong, when a leader misnames somebody or misgenders someone, what's that all-in correction in the moment? And what is that systematic follow-through that prevents repeats?
Sure, that's a good one. I would try to keep it simple here. What I have sort of in frame of mind is how I would want someone to sort of respond to me. So the first thing is correct quickly and cleanly is probably the way I would sort of say that. So if someone corrects me is like, hey, thanks for the correction, I appreciate that. Or if I see it in another place where someone might misname or misgender a colleague, is if it seems appropriate, like I will sort of step in and do the quickly and cleanly thing of like, hey, actually, this person goes by this, or here shall I pronounce this. So I would say that's the first thing, and then ensuring if it's me who's sort of making the mistake there, which, I've done, let's be clear, I've made plenty of mistakes here. I think it's important to repair privately. So just a brief check-in with the other person and really making sure you're centering them and not you. So this is not about my guilt, about making it right. It's really around, hey, like, how can I make sure going forward we make this better for you, and how can I help others get this right as well? And I would say that, the systematic thing that you talk about too, Christopher, is really around take a look at that sort of systematically. So are the rosters correct? Like if someone is sort of mislabeled or mispronounced, are scripts right? Or do we need to sort of put in phonetics, pronunciation for something that's out there? So really, I would say sort of atonement without systems really just repeats the harm in that as well. So those would be my 3 tips. So correct quickly and cleanly, repair privately, and then sort of look for changes systemically as well.
Yeah, I think the repair privately piece is really important, but also the part that you talked about, don't make it about yourself, right?
Yeah.
Yes, you're the one who made the mistake, but if you're focused on the woe is me and I'm so sorry, it really takes away from you just doing the right thing. And so take the correction, apply the correction, and move on. So the focus is actually the conversation, the relationship that you're trying to build, not focused on the harm that you just created.
Yeah, that's well said.
So moving into your I know I belong here moment, describe a time in your career, perhaps stepping into an executive HR role or even launching your own consulting group, when you felt like you were truly invited, seen, and heard. What specifically made belonging real for you?
It's a great question. The example I would use is early on when I was launching my own consulting group in this space, a client of mine, it was probably my first client interaction sort of out on my own, kind of in the wild. And the client asked and sort of had known me and what I had done in the past, right? And so they asked me to come in as an external coach. And they invited me in, and it wasn't just necessarily for my expertise, but it was really for my perspectives, the truth telling, the partnership that I'd sort of demonstrated with that. So the sense of belonging that I just felt there was like they trusted me with the work and with themselves. And to me, sort of that trust is like, that's what belonging feels like to me. It's when my presence isn't just welcome, but it's needed as part of the process that they're sort of going through. And that's what makes belonging feel real to me.
So you talk about in your book about going from awareness to amplification. How do you, in the moment, evolve that awareness acknowledgement into amplification using your seat to elevate others?
Sure. If I go back to the framework, right, the first couple steps, which I've already sort of mentioned, so around, awareness is really helping me to notice and see what's happening. Acknowledgement is really what helps me to start to name it. But if I go back to moving from that passive to active stance, there, amplification requires action. So whether that's like sponsoring women in the stretch roles, interrupting bias in performance calibrations or discussions, and really using my seat at the table to elevate voices that weren't being heard. The shortcut that I sort of often use about this is like amplification is the awareness with a megaphone. So it's really around taking that amplification and sort of then blasting it out of what I am noticing in that space.
I really like that. I really like that. Amplification is inclusion with a megaphone. I think that's really, really powerful. Okay, so we've talked about some of the good stuff about belonging, but this would not be the I Know I Belong When podcast if we didn't talk about when belonging doesn't work. So this inclusion work can get lonely. And as a white man, or we are two white men advocating for DEI, what's a concrete instance where you felt like you didn't belong? Either resistance in a boardroom, skepticism on a team. How do you stay present without centering the work on yourself?
Yeah, this is a good one. I mean, there are a lot of times when I do walk into a boardroom or a conference room and I look around the room and, it's a lot of people who look like me. And if you're not sort of watching this podcast and just listening, I'm, a middle-aged, gray-haired white guy with a blue button down on. So I'm pretty typical in all of those senses. So I will go in and conversations will happen and I will push, right? And I do think there are times when people look a little bit sideways or I'll push on a comment that's made or sort of say, hey, hang on, let's kind of revisit that particular decision or conversation. And there's a parts when it feels lonely in the sense of like, I get the sense of people are thinking like, hey, what's his angle? Like, what's he trying to do? And, what I really try to stay centered in that is like, instead of retreating in that, which is really easy to do, I really try to listen, stay grounded in the purpose and it's not about my ego. And it's really like, this work isn't about me. It's really about the people who aren't in the room and just trying to remember that as much as I can in those conversations.
I think that's really impactful. I think also the privilege that we have when we come into a room is we can sometimes say the things that other people can't.
Sure.
And we also can make it a little less heavy, when we are challenging it because people look at us and go, well, they're just like us, so we should probably listen to them, right? They give us the benefit of the doubt sometimes because of the privilege that we're walking into the room, right? We have that white male privilege. And so you and I have talked about this before. How are we using our privilege for good? Right. And how are we using it to open doors, to start conversations that some folks who may not look like us is a harder thing to start. Right.
Absolutely.
And so for us, it's using that to ignite the conversation, but make sure we're pulling people who have different lived experiences than us into the conversation so that they can also be able to use their voice and have their voice represented, not through our own filter.
Right. I agree. And it goes back to something that we were talking about earlier about privilege has somehow sort of gotten this bad name or rapture or something out there about this. And it's sort of like, oh, don't question my privilege. Privilege it's not meant to be weaponized. It's just around creating awareness that there is privilege that's there. And, often, I always sort of say this thing too, of like, often my privilege walks in the room 10 steps ahead of me. So, I mean, people know I'm coming, and just for me to start to be aware of that and how that really shows up. So it's really about exactly kind of what you just said too, is around not using the privilege as a weapon, but really using it for good and acknowledging that.
Yeah. And also recognize that folks who look like us in today's time, we didn't necessarily create the system of privilege, though we are benefiting from it. And so we have to recognize the benefits that we're getting. We didn't create necessarily the system, but just our privileges perpetuating the system. And so what are we doing to help change and dismantle the system of privilege that we have so that the gender and the color of our skin are not giving us an added benefit, right?
Yeah,
we are
absolutely.
Truly showing up that we are graded on the content of our character, not the color of our skin.
Yep, absolutely. Well said.
So going from this very performative work that sometimes happen, because I definitely don't like performative work, into that principled matter, what is that one common performative inclusion move you see leaders make, and how do you help them replace it with a principled, measurable commitment?
Yes, I'll tell you a very common one that I see. But again, I kind of go back to the framework of allyship being passive, all in is sort of active, committed sort of thing there. So one thing I often see, especially with leaders, is, they have this open door policy, or my door is always open, kind of thing. And they think, oh, like, that's it. Like, that's good. And that, see, I'm inclusive. My challenge to them is like, that's performative, right? You are then sitting in your office, or, sort of waiting for others to kind of come to you and things like that. To flip this, to answer your question of a more principled approach, is like, it's like having that open door sort of policy, or office hours and things like that are fine and great, but be more principled about it. So schedule listening sessions, or inviting people in, even if it's for like a 10-minute increment, that you're having someone come in and kind of with that. And then you're tracking themes. So a lot of times I will tell leaders, even track your themes. If you have a whiteboard in your office, like, track the themes of what you're hearing on the whiteboard. So as others come in, they can sort of see what others are saying, and then really acting on what you hear, and, going back and saying, hey, this is what I've been hearing in the last month's office hours that I've been having, or the people that, have come in, and sharing that back to the group with that. So I think like that, to me, to really moves from that performative of like, I have an open door policy, to really principled in sort of what you're doing in it. So one of the catchphrases that I often sort of use with leaders that seems to resonate is, your intent is invisible, but your impact is measurable. So really about how do you start to show sort of the impact and what's out there as well? Because no one can see. I can say, oh, I had such great intent about that, but no one sees that.
Yeah. One of the things I talk about is, no matter what your intent was, it's the impact that's important, right?
Absolutely.
So even if I didn't intend to say a racist thing, if what came out of my mouth was impacted in a way that was deemed to be racist, well, guess what? That was the impact, right?
Absolutely.
I didn't mean, my intent was not to make somebody upset or make somebody feel bad, but the impact of my actions did that. I talk to my children about this all the time. It's like, I love your intent, but this is how you impacted people. And
Sure.
So it's really about that, because the impact is visible. And so how are we making sure that, we intended to stand up, we intended to call that bias out. Well, you may have intended to do it, but your impact of not calling the bias out allowed the bias to continue to happen. And
Absolutely.
so well-intentioned doesn't mean anything.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So can you share a time with me when you got it wrong? How did you practice atonement and accountability in repairing trust and challenging behavior without retreating into defensiveness or guilt?
Yeah. And let me start by saying this too, Christopher, that I get it wrong often. So even though like I spend my career now sort of doing this work and really focusing on work, I still get it wrong. But the key is to sort of kind of keep coming back, keep trying. But there's one particular scenario, and I actually write about this in the book, where I led a project. I was responsible for the project. I was the accountable executive, where we were updating a facility, and that included the restrooms, right? And so again, this kind of goes back to the conversation, right? I had the right intent, but what we were trying to do was we were trying to include more gender neutral bathrooms within the building. And that ended up just sparking frustration. And again, when I had the right intent, but I failed in execution on this. And what ended up happening, it's a long story, but short story happened, is we ended up sort of switching over some of the disabled bathrooms that then became gender neutral bathrooms. Like the contractor sort of took it upon themselves to kind of make that switch, and signage and all of that included. Well, that sent a message that was not intended in a bunch of different ways. Where the original intent was to try to be more inclusive, it ended up creating, like I said, sort of frustration. This actually was brought up to me in a public sort of all hands forum of someone questioned this. And, I had that moment of standing up there and trying to launch into, yeah, but I tried this and we meant to do this. And like, that was my intent. And let me go back, and really I just apologized. Like, it was a mistake that we made. I really tried to do it without defensiveness, and then asked for input as we went forward, and really around creating different sort of processes where we would be more inclusive of, okay, as we're making decisions about the physical space in the building, that we're going to be more inclusive about bringing in sort of all sorts of different viewpoints and perspectives. And not that we can or do or say and change every little thing that everyone's saying, but at least they'll always feel like they're having input in there. So being held accountable was really, like, in a public forum, was important to me. And, the lesson from that is, like, really accountability in my mind isn't punishment. It's really around improvement. So how can I be better? And really kind of that mental flip of that. If someone holds you accountable, they're not looking to punish you. It's really helping you improve. And again, like, I have an appreciation for the fact that someone stood up in an all hands meeting, as much as I felt like I just wanted to, like, crawl into a hole in that moment, but just called me out on it and sort of was watching my reaction to that. So I definitely made mistakes along the way.
I think we all have. We're human, right? We're not infallible creatures, right? So, we make mistakes, but it's also about how we stand up from them and react and make sure that we can do better. This brings me to thinking about, in my own leadership roles that I've had, and the unintended consequences that happen from some actions, right? And so how are we, we're trying to be inclusive of people who are transgender, but then that may be counter to what the people with disability community needs, or we're making something that feels like it's a good decision in promoting equality for women, but that may have an unintended consequence on gay men in an organization. And so how are we making sure that when we're pulling a lever to promote inclusiveness for one group, how could that potentially inadvertently create exclusion for another group? And so those things where we just have to kind of take a moment and kind of look back at that 35,000 foot level and going, okay, if I take this action, what are the unintended consequences that could be impacted downstream that we just need to be thinking about and taking a pause? Some are inevitable, but what are we doing to make sure that we're trying to lessen those unintended consequences that happen by the work that we're doing?
Yeah. And thing I would add to that is being humble enough to ask. Right? To not sit there and try to figure it out on your own, but to go out and sort of say, hey, I'm struggling with this particular thing. I'm coming at this from a straight white male perspective. Like, there's other perspectives that are out there. What are some other perspectives that are in there that I can pull into the decision making for this?
Yeah. And so to help us with that decision making process and trying to make sure that we sustain belonging for everyone, what are the metrics that tell you belonging is actually increasing beyond the engagement scores? How do we link them to performance and reward leaders accordingly?
I'll give you, there's a lot of different things that different organizations start to measure. So I'll give you three that I think are important, and they sort of range from bigger, broader metrics to then sometimes like more the things you can measure sort of right away. The first thing, which that's sort of a meeting thing, right? It's distribution of airtime. So, right, like, who's speaking, who's influencing decisions, and even assigning a role, like, right within the meeting of, hey, can someone keep track of this? And then what we're going to do is we're going to sort of look at the trend over time. Who is sort of owning the space and distributing airtime? And, in some places it would make sense just based on positional authority and things like that someone's taking up more time and things like that. But again, it's creating sort of the systems around you that you're starting to notice those things. So distribution of airtime is something that you can start doing tomorrow in a meeting that you have and sort of starting to track that. I would say a second thing is probably more macro thing in an organization is really around promotion velocity. So who's advancing? How quickly are they advancing? Again, start to notice and start to measure those things. So if your organization has stretch roles, for example, promotable roles or whatever that organization might call them, does a white male sit in that stretch role for 6 months and then they get promoted? Or, does a woman have to sort of sit in that stretch role for a year and prove themselves for a year before they get noticed? And sort of, again, and then start to sort of track that over time and notice, like, are there trends that are here that we need to become more aware of? So really tracking and measuring that promotion velocity, I think, is something important there. And then, one that I think is important to everyone is really the retention of those historically excluded groups. So like, are they leaving the organization or are they not? And sort of what are you noticing? And by the way, which I would encourage everyone to do, is anyone who's leaving an organization, it'd be great to do an exit interview of some sort, whether even a quick sort of survey to them about sort of why are you leaving, where are you going, things like that. Again, to sort of start to pick up different things and are there things that can be addressed with that too? So, while I agree with you, like engagement scores do matter, but, the behavior and the outcomes, I think, are the things that start to tell the real story in these places too.
Yeah, I think, and to expand on the point of exit interviews, also the importance of stay interviews.
Oh, great.
And how are we making sure that people, why do you want to stay here, right? What is going to take you to get to stay? Because when people are leaving, great information to give us. However, we just lost an opportunity to get you to stay. So, I think exit interviews are definitely important, but I would also advocate to people on what are you doing to conduct stay interviews with your people so you don't lose good people.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And actually, let me build on that real quick too, because that's an excellent point. I actually think too, like, are people staying with leaders, right? Because, the saying of people quit leaders or leave leaders, right? Like who is sticking around with those leaders, and what are those leaders doing to kind of make the folks feel included that they want to stay? Now, people stay for a bunch of different reasons, but that's an interesting sort of tidbit to potentially measure as well, of what those leaders potentially are doing to keep people around them and on their teams.
Yeah, no, that's really important. We do know that people leave managers, they don't leave their organization, right? Yeah, so how are we making sure that the managers are creating that sense of belonging for folks on their teams and those around us? Okay, so we're going to start to bring this conversation to a close. So if every white male leader listening today made one public commitment this quarter, what would it be? And what would the follow through look like 90 days later?
Sure. I'm going to keep this simple, right? So this is something that someone can start doing today as soon as they finish listening to this podcast. The all-in pledge that I would want them to do is commit to one person in your organization. So sponsor someone whose identity is different than yours or is underrepresented in the leadership ranks. Like commit to them and sponsor them. So this is not about mentoring, but really sponsoring them. So what this is using your own privilege or political capital, might be a word that resonates more for you, but using your own political capital to create visibility for them, to create opportunities for them, to create sort of ways of advancing them, and really just checking in with them to sort of see how they're doing, really, really investing in sponsoring that one particular person. So just start there, right? And then the other simple thing is like in 90 days, just ask them how they're doing. Like, how's it going? Have they experienced different things? Have they been more exposed to different business problems? Are they asking to solve different answers? Are they attending different meetings than they were prior to this relationship? And I think that to me would sort of be an indication of like, hey, feels like someone's being invested in, and again, being more actively included in the organization.
Yeah, sponsorship is so important. Mentorship is one thing. Sponsorship is about what are you doing when that person is not in the room with you? Right? How are you speaking their name and supporting them when they're not standing right next to you? That's really the key point. I know sponsorship has worked for me and it's worked for others. And so sponsorship is key to how we are going to continue to advance inclusion and belonging and diversify our organizations.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
As we continue to wrap up this conversation, I am asking all of my guests to finish the sentence, I know I belong when. So Mike, I know I belong when?
So I would say, I know I belong when I can fully show up, aware of my privilege, honest about my imperfections and shortcomings, and I'm committed to using my influence to create space for others. Belonging for me isn't about comfort, it's about contribution. And I belong when the work that I'm doing helps others be seen, heard, and really supported in the ways that allow them to thrive.
That's really powerful. I really also like about being vulnerable about your shortcomings, right? Because I think that's really powerful. I think we sometimes in a very US-centric kind of mindset, we don't want to show our weaknesses, on quote unquote, right? But when we can be vulnerable and have that psychological safety to say, I made a mistake, or just let mistakes happen and know that we can correct from them, is knowing that you belong someplace. And that's really powerful. So Mike, this has been a great conversation and an absolute pleasure, and a wonderful reminder that belonging is not a destination, it is a practice, and it starts with listening. So friends, if this episode challenged you to move outside your comfort zone, please follow the show, give us that 5-star review you know you want to give, and add a comment about what you will do to champion a culture of belonging today. Those actions will help to amplify the message to others, and we want to hear from you. Finish the sentence, I know I belong when, and send us a voice note. Your story could open a future episode. Thank you for listening, and know that your bold, authentic self is welcomed, valued, and loved. And until next time, remember, you belong here.